He stepped onto the trail like he had countless times before, but this time something was different. His map, carefully folded to a page that didn't exist, pointed him toward a place no one should go. His gear was found neatly arranged beside an abandoned footbridge, no signs of struggle, no trace of him. But as the search deepened, the woods began to answer with echoes and shadows, shadows that moved when no one was looking. What happened to Ethan Hale? The trail leads somewhere, but it might not lead back. The backpack lay on its side, but not carelessly. The straps were flattened, the zippers closed, and the fabric brushed clean of mud as if someone had taken time to smooth it down. Beside it, his compact stove, water filter, and rolled sleeping bag formed a tidy row that looked more like a display than an abandoned camp. Nothing was scattered, torn, or obviously misplaced. It appeared at first glance as though Ethan had knelt there at the base of the bridge embankment, unpacked his essentials, and then stepped away for just a moment. The footbridge itself rose ahead of the scene like a relic from another era, its wooden planks gray and warped, railings splintered and leaning toward a creek that had carved the gorge deeper year after year. Official park maps marked the structure as closed decades earlier, its route rerouted upstream to a newer crossing. Yet there was Ethan's gear, pressed into the damp earth as if the bridge had still been part of his plan. It should not have been. According to his digital itinerary, uploaded to a shared folder the night before he left, his loop was meant to stay 3 valleys west, nowhere near this forgotten crossing. The map that should have confirmed that plan was tucked in the front pocket of his pack, folded with the same precise care that defined the rest of his life. When investigators slid it free and unfolded it on the hood of a park ranger's truck, they expected to see the familiar loop of Alder Creek Trail traced in pen, annotated with distance notes and campsite options. Instead, their eyes locked on the sharp crease that split the page down the middle, neatly isolating a secondary page, one Ethan had never mentioned, one that led away from designated routes and into a pale, unmarked corner of terrain simply labeled with an old survey symbol and a faded name, Mossford Crossing. No one on the current ranger staff could remember ever hearing that name before the case file opened. The park's official topographic maps showed nothing at that coordinate except contour lines and tree cover. Older archival charts pulled from a locked cabinet in the maintenance depot hinted at an outdated spur trail once sketched through that region, but the notation had been crossed out in red pencil sometime in the late 1980s. Whatever Mossford Crossing had been, it was not supposed to exist on any map a modern backpacker would carry. Yet Ethan's map showed it clearly. The print was faint but legible, a thin gray ribbon indicating a spur trail branching away from the main loop and running along the creek toward the very footbridge where his pack had been found. Someone, at some point, had included Mossford Crossing on this edition, only for the park's official signage and digital files to later erase all reference to it. That alone might have been brushed off as a printing error or an outdated revision, if not for the condition of the fold itself. The crease bisecting the page was sharp, recent, and undeniably intentional. Paper that had been folded and unfolded on countless trips developed a soft memory, rounded at the edges, its fibers relaxed into familiar lines. This fold looked different. Its edges were crisp, the angle perfectly aligned to bring Mossford Crossing into the center of view, while the actual Alder Creek route, the trail Ethan had told his friends and family he would be hiking, was partially hidden under the bend. Someone, at some point, had wanted this page visible more than any other, had pressed it into place as if making a decision. For the investigators gathered around the truck in the gravel turnout, the map raised as many questions about intent as it did about direction. Ethan was not impulsive. Years of GPS logs, notes, and social media posts showed routes planned days in advance, itineraries shared with at least one person every time. He did not chase rumors, ghost trails, or half-remembered landmarks scribbled onto aging paper. If he had truly meant to explore Mossford Crossing, someone would have known.
Yet there was no text, no digital message, no recorded audio suggesting a change in plan. More unsettling was the way the terrain around the footbridge seemed to conspire with the mystery of the map. The air close to the creek ran colder than the rest of the forest, a narrow corridor of chilled breath that clung to skin and equipment alike. Sound changed there too. Voices thrown across the water came back with a faint delay, just long enough to feel wrong, as if the echo had to travel a little farther than the visible banks allowed. On the far side of the bridge, the trail narrowed into overgrowth, not a single boot print pressed into the damp soil. Whoever or whatever had folded that map page seemed to be pointing Ethan toward a place that no longer wanted tracks. The map suggested a trail that had been erased from the land, leaving only its memory in the worn creases of paper and the name fading quietly beneath his fingertips. Yet for all the unease the fold inspired, there was still nothing in the scene that proved Ethan had actually followed it. His boots were missing, his trekking poles gone, his body unseen. The only new direction left to follow was hidden in one blurred photo.
Ethan Hale had grown up with the kind of landscape that produces a particular kind of mind, one shaped by wide plains, crisp mountain air, and forests that seemed to stretch forever without interruption. Born in a small Montana town where hiking was as natural as breathing, he learned early how to read a compass, how to gauge distance by the angle of a ridge, and how to sense weather by the way spruce needles shifted in the wind. Those who knew him often said he didn't walk through wilderness so much as move with it, adapting to its rhythms instead of forcing his own. By his late 20s, he had become the sort of backpacker others quietly admired, steady, observant, unshakably disciplined. Nothing about Ethan fit the profile of someone who wandered off route by mistake. He was calculated in every decision, gear sorted by weight and purpose, meals portioned down to exact calories, emergency plans sketched in the margins of his map. Even his recreational trips reflected precision. When he hiked Alder Creek Trail the previous summer, he documented every stream crossing, every campsite, every small change in terrain. His pack list never varied, his habits rarely shifted, and he shared his itinerary each time with his sister, Ava, who lived 2 states away but kept his trip logs saved on her phone. Yet in the months leading up to his disappearance, subtle changes crept into Ethan's behavior. Friends noticed he had become unusually curious about old routes, trails that had been decommissioned decades earlier or abandoned entirely when the park expanded its preservation zones. His internet history revealed searches for historical topographic surveys, pored over out-of-date guidebooks, and asked about forgotten footpaths that even longtime rangers barely remembered. His internet history revealed searches for pre-digital trail systems, structures built before the 1970s, and one recurring term that would later trouble investigators: lost crossings. To most people, the phrase was meaningless. To Ethan, it became a puzzle he couldn't let go of. He mentioned it offhandedly during a phone call with a colleague, saying he'd stumbled across unmapped sounds near Alder Creek during a previous hike, an echo that didn't match the topography. The colleague assumed he was talking about reverberations from the river canyon and didn't think much of it. But Ethan had written the moment down in his personal notebook, the same one his family found on his kitchen table after he vanished. The notes didn't read like rambling theories. They read like observations from a man who trusted his senses completely and knew the wilderness well enough to tell when something felt out of place.
Echo lasted too long, one line read. Sound curve doesn't match creek bank, another said. And then, a week before he left for his final trip, heard something travel under the bridge, no water motion. No one knew what he meant, not yet. Despite these peculiar entries, Ethan didn't appear anxious or unstable. His coworkers at a local engineering firm said he remained the same quiet, reliable presence he had always been, calm, deliberate, composed. The only visible change was his newfound fixation on one particular area of Alder Creek, the region closest to the old footbridge. He returned there twice in the month before his disappearance. According to his phone's GPS archive, each visit ended the same way. He slowed his pace as he approached the bridge, lingered for several minutes, then turned back without crossing. His watch recorded sharp spikes in heart rate in those moments, not the spikes of panic, but of recognition, like a sudden understanding he couldn't yet articulate. Ava, his sister, later said Ethan sounded distracted in a focused way, as though something tugged at his thoughts even while he spoke normally. During a video call days before he left, she noticed him glancing toward the window several times, not nervously but attentively, like he was monitoring the outside world for a sound he expected but couldn't quite predict. When she asked if something was wrong, he smiled and shook his head, telling her only that the forest feels different at Alder Creek. Ethan rarely spoke about feelings. He preferred measurable data to vague sensations, so his comment stayed with her. After his disappearance, she returned to his notebook and reread every page. One entry in particular unsettled her, a sketch of Alder Creek's trail system with a small X marked near the old footbridge, accompanied by the words, "Something pulling here." The handwriting was steady, not frantic. Whatever he sensed didn't frighten him, it intrigued him. Digging deeper into his digital files, investigators uncovered dozens of audio clips Ethan had recorded on past hikes. Most were simple nature captures, wind whistling through canyons, river water tumbling over rocks. But one audio file differed from the rest. It was recorded 2 trips before he vanished, lasting only 9 seconds. The clip began with the ambient sound of rushing water, normal, consistent, then shifted unexpectedly into a deeper resonance that did not match the river's natural frequency. The sound resembled a hum, low and sustained, the type of vibration produced not by nature, but by engineered structures or enclosed spaces. Yet there were no structures near the abandoned footbridge, no tunnels, no cavities, nothing that could have produced such a tone. Investigators replayed the audio dozens of times, examining waveforms, filtering frequencies, comparing the hum to mechanical sources. No match emerged. The resonance was too smooth, too rhythmic, too organic to be machinery. Ethan never labeled the file, but the timestamp placed him within view of the old bridge. That hum became the first objective anomaly in a case that seemed increasingly defined by subtle, intelligent distortions of the environment.
The final piece of Ethan's profile emerged through interviews with rangers who had spoken with him before. One ranger recalled Ethan asking about out-of-date survey routes. Another remembered him examining the footbridge from a distance, almost like someone trying to reconcile its visible structure with a memory that didn't belong to him. None of these details screamed danger. They pointed instead to curiosity, a curiosity that appeared to strengthen each time he returned. It wasn't until investigators collected all of Ethan's journals, GPS logs, and audio files that a pattern surfaced. He had traced nearly every part of Alder Creek Trail over the years, except the footbridge area. That segment, ironically the easiest to access before its closure, was the one he had never crossed. His hesitation wasn't based on fear. It was based on instinct, an intuition that something beyond that bridge didn't behave like the rest of the forest. Yet, on the morning he disappeared, he went straight to it, alone, without telling anyone he planned to diverge from his loop, without recording a reason, without leaving a final note. His last journal entry, written the night before he left, was torn at the edge. Only a fragment remained visible. "Something past the bridge is..." The sentence ended abruptly. The page was ripped, not cut, as if removed in haste. When investigators dusted the torn page for prints, they found Ethan's fingerprints, but also a second partial print beside it, wider, longer, and belonging to no one in any database. Long before Ethan Hale ever set foot on Alder Creek, the abandoned bridge had already earned a reputation among rangers, one built not on legend or folklore, but on a series of quiet, persistent irregularities no one could fully explain. The structure itself was unremarkable at first glance. 30 feet of warped planks spanning a narrow section of the creek, supported by rusted steel braces that angled sharply into the water. Moss grew thick along the railings, and the wood carried the gray patina of decades of storms and sun. What made the bridge unsettling was not its appearance, but its presence, a sense that it remained suspended between relevance and erasure, refusing to collapse entirely, yet no longer belonging to any officially maintained trail. When the park shut it down in the late 1980s, the reason seemed straightforward. A series of minor structural shifts, likely caused by shifting water pressure beneath the creek, had rendered it unsafe. Rather than repair a rarely used crossing, the park rerouted the trail upstream and allowed the old footbridge to fade naturally back into the landscape. Over time, foliage thickened along its edges, tree branches arched overhead, and the area around it slipped into quiet disuse. Hikers eventually stopped seeking it out, maps stopped listing it, and the rangers who patrolled the region treated it as little more than a relic, an artifact of a time before modern trail reconstruction. But something about the bridge refused to behave like a structure left to decay. The first sign came from wildlife, animals that frequented the creek, deer, foxes, even raccoons, avoided the immediate vicinity of the bridge. Their tracks circled wide around it, pressing into the mud like a perfect arc. Even in winter, when snow flattened out most animal pathways, the bridge's perimeter remained a silent void of untouched powder. The absence wasn't merely coincidence, it became a defining feature of the area. Creatures that instinctively wandered into all other parts of the forest stepped around the bridge as if it were a barrier only they could sense. Rangers chalked it up to instinctual avoidance of unstable ground. Yet the bridge's structure told a different story. While the planks were weathered and warped, they remained firmly attached. The railing slanted but did not crack. The braces leaned but did not snap. In windstorms that uprooted trees and flooded minor trails, the abandoned footbridge held. It creaked, swayed, and groaned under pressure, but year after year, it remained intact enough that some younger rangers privately wondered why it had ever been closed. Still, subtle anomalies persisted, ones rangers acknowledged only in quiet conversations or offhand remarks. The most common involved sound. When someone stood near the bridge and called out across the creek, their voice returned with a faint, delayed echo, longer than the distance should have allowed. The creek was narrow, and the canopy above created no natural amphitheater, yet the echo behaved as though bouncing off a much larger space, returning with softened edges like a whisper carried through a tunnel. Some described it as disorienting. Others said it made them feel watched. No one could explain it. Temperature shifts around the bridge added another layer of strangeness. In cool mornings, a faint warmth lingered around the planks, warmer than the surrounding air. In summer, the opposite occurred, with pockets of cold drifting along the railings even under direct sunlight. These pockets moved slowly, like invisible currents slipping from one part of the bridge to another, settling briefly before fading. Rangers dismissed them as airflow quirks, though none of them had experienced similar shifts elsewhere on the trail system. Against this backdrop of small but accumulating oddities, Ethan's decision to approach the bridge held more weight. He was a backpacker who respected consistency, who trusted patterns and structure. Something unusual had drawn him toward a place clearly defined by inconsistency. When investigators retraced his final route, they found signs that he had paused repeatedly along the path, as though listening. The trees along that path seemed to lean inward subtly, their trunks curving just enough to suggest directional pressure, an optical illusion perhaps,
but consistent enough that each ranger who walked the trail independently described the same sensation, a narrowing of space.
When the team reached the creekside clearing where Ethan's gear had been found, the quiet felt heavier than silence. The water moved steadily beneath the bridge, but the sound of its motion didn't carry naturally. It felt muffled, as if passing through a filter. Leaves along the embankment remained still despite a light breeze elsewhere in the forest. Even insects seemed absent. The space had a quality not unlike a room holding its breath. Then came the footprints. Though the soil was soft enough to capture impressions, no fresh tracks led onto the bridge or away from it. Only a pair of partial prints stood at the near edge, too incomplete to identify as Ethan's, too aligned to be random. They faced the bridge directly, toes angled toward the first plank, but instead of continuing forward, they simply ended. Investigators believed Ethan had stood there, evaluating whether to cross, yet nothing explained why the ground around the bridge remained so undisturbed. No scuffs, no signs of pacing, no indication he had moved away. The soil looked brushed clean, as if gently reset. When they examined the underside of the bridge using a drone, the mystery deepened. The drone's infrared camera picked up an unusual geometric outline beneath the water, a rectangular shape, too straight to be natural, positioned directly under the old crossing. Its faint edges mirrored the footprint of a second structure, as though a former version of the bridge still lingered beneath the surface. The outline wasn't consistent with erosion or submerged debris. It resembled a reflection, yet no light source existed to produce one. On a subsequent pass, the drone captured something else, a vertical distortion at the edge of the creek, like heat shimmer rising from pavement on a summer highway. But the morning was cool, the air still, the water temperature stable. The distortion rippled upward before dissolving into the canopy, leaving no trace behind. Rangers reviewing the footage felt an involuntary tension settle in their shoulders. Whatever had caused the shape was not wind, water, or wildlife. It was something else, something responding to the drone's movement as though aware of being observed. The footbridge offered no answers, only a location anchored by anomalies and silence. Yet everything about the scene, Ethan's gear arrangement, the folded map, the partial prints, suggested he had stepped closer to this place than anyone expected. And whatever drew him here hadn't been random. It had been intentional, deliberate, calculated in a way that made the mere presence of the bridge feel less like a forgotten structure and more like an invitation. When investigators enhanced the drone footage frame by frame, the outline beneath the water sharpened, revealing what looked like the faint impression of a second set of footprints crossing a bridge that no longer existed. From the moment investigators unfolded Ethan Hale's map across the ranger station table, they understood this case would not follow the logic of any ordinary disappearance. Maps were meant to guide, to clarify, to reveal where a person intended to go. But Ethan's map did the opposite. It obscured, misdirected, and pointed toward a place that should not have existed at all. And the more they studied it, the more the paper behaved like an artifact caught between two versions of the forest, one that hikers trusted and another hidden behind folds and forgotten survey lines that no modern trail system acknowledged. The map itself was standard issue, printed just 4 years earlier, complete with updated topography, campsite markers, and boundary lines for Alder Creek. These maps were distributed by the park office, routinely replaced when weathering or new trail adjustments demanded updated versions. Nothing about the overall design suggested anything unusual. No misprints, no outdated symbology, no alternative route overlays. But one page differed from the rest, the page Ethan had folded with sharp precision. It aligned perfectly over a blank region of the forest labeled only with altitude markers. Yet behind the faint contour lines lay something else. Embedded within the paper's ink layers, barely visible unless tilted under direct light, were ghost-like remnants of a path that should not have been printed there at all. This faint line, a thin gray curve, didn't match the style of the map's other trails. It lacked trailhead notation, campsite icons, and elevation indicators. Instead, it looked like an older surveyor's route, copied faintly into early printing layers and never fully erased. Modern printing processes made such accidental overlays nearly impossible. The part used digital plates, not recycled layers. So the existence of that faint line troubled the investigators, especially since the line led directly toward the abandoned footbridge. Further scrutiny of the paper revealed another anomaly. The fold Ethan created didn't follow existing crease lines molded over years of use. It cut crisply through the page, newly formed, crisp enough that fibers at the crease's edge still held tension. The fold's direction concealed portions of the official trail he was supposed to follow and foregrounded the ghost path almost perfectly, as though arranged intentionally to guide his eyes toward the one place he'd avoided for years. What made the fold even stranger was the warmth embedded into the paper fibers. Forensic technicians noted that the folded region held slightly more heat than the rest, an unusual finding given that the map had been found outdoors in cool morning temperatures. Heat retention in paper dissipates quickly, yet the fold maintained warmth even hours later. Analysis under ultraviolet light revealed faint smudges along the fold line, fingerprints belonging to Ethan. But beneath his prints lay another layer of smudge, slightly larger, longer, and located at an angle inconsistent with how Ethan normally handled maps. This secondary print did not match any ranger, investigator, or person associated with Ethan. Its shape suggested a broader fingertip than typical human proportions. The ridge pattern was incomplete, as though the print had been transferred not from direct contact, but from pressure. Pressure applied gently, deliberately, with enough force to shape the fold, but not enough to leave a full print. The investigators replayed Ethan's final days through the lens of this map. He had planned a simple loop, outlined in his itinerary and mirrored by the gear he carried. His campsite selections and day-by-day route aligned precisely with that loop until he reached the stretch near the footbridge. There, his GPS track deviated, not sharply, not chaotically, but gradually, as if he drifted toward a direction he shouldn't have considered. The map fold likely came before that moment. Someone or something had placed the fold to redirect him. The path visible on the folded page bore no resemblance to the trail system of the modern park. Rangers compared it to archival maps dating back to the early 20th century. Only one document, a brittle, yellowed surveyor chart from 1926, contained any trace of a similar route. In the margins of that chart, a handwritten note mentioned temporary crossing constructed for seasonal research. The footbridge appeared on that old map too, marked as a short-term structure built over a shallow section of the creek. But the expected trail that should have connected to the crossing was crossed out in thick charcoal pencil. The surveyor had erased it intentionally. Alongside the strikeout, another note read, "Remove from public maps, unreliable terrain." No elaboration, no follow-up explanation. The modern park maps had honored that removal, until Ethan's edition surfaced with its faint ghost trace. What troubled investigators further was a peculiar pattern discovered when overlaying Ethan's map fold onto satellite images of the area. The ghost trail, the one faintly visible only when the map was creased, perfectly matched a sequence of shadow lines seen in aerial photographs. These shadows appeared inconsistently, showing up only in early morning or late afternoon light, and only under certain seasonal conditions. They looked like impressions left behind by something no longer present, the faint hint of a sunken path, barely recognizable beneath decades of natural regrowth. But the alignment between the map's crease and the satellite shadows was too precise to dismiss. As the team deepened their analysis, they discovered additional oddities around the region marked by the ghost trail. Temperature sensors placed along that section of forest recorded heat anomalies at regular intervals, a rhythmic pulsing of warmth that rippled across the undergrowth like breath. Soil samples revealed displaced sediment patterns, suggesting movement through the ground rather than over it. The footprints recovered near the footbridge showed no connection to this region, yet the soil disturbances implied something traveled that direction frequently enough to alter the environment subtly. Ethan's notebook contained a sketch that now seemed prophetic. Weeks earlier, he had drawn a thin line connecting Alder Creek to an unlabeled spur captioned with, "Something here doesn't match the map." At the time, he hadn't identified what he sensed. But when investigators compared his hand-drawn line to the ghost trail, the match was striking. Ethan had perceived something before physically encountering it, an inconsistency in the land that he couldn't yet articulate. The question that loomed over the investigation was no longer whether Ethan had followed the ghost trail. It was whether the trail had revealed itself to him. Perhaps only certain conditions, certain times, certain observers caused the path to appear. Ethan's repeatedly documented intuition near the footbridge suggested the landscape sent signals, subtle cues only he noticed. When the map fold pointed him toward Mossford Crossing, it may not have been chance. It may have been synchronization between the map's hidden layer and the trail's shifting presence. But the most unsettling discovery came when investigators examined the back of the folded page. Embedded in the paper grain, almost invisible except under angled light, was a faint indentation. Not ink, not pencil, but pressure. The shape resembled a narrow curve, like the imprint of a fingertip drawing a line downward. The indentation aligned perfectly with the ghost trail, as if someone had pressed their finger along the page to emphasize the direction. Not Ethan. He had no reason to mark a trail he never planned to walk. Someone, or something else, had drawn his attention to the page. And when investigators checked the map under infrared light one final time, a new detail surfaced, an arrow pointing toward the ghost trail, one that hadn't been visible before, as if it appeared only after Ethan vanished. When the search teams first entered the dense woods around the abandoned footbridge, the forest seemed almost ordinary. The trees were tall and thick with deep green pine needles, the underbrush dense with moss and fallen branches, and the creek ran steadily as it always had. But as the day wore on, it became apparent that the landscape here was no ordinary stretch of wilderness. Something about the area surrounding the footbridge didn't behave the way it should. Small, subtle inconsistencies in the forest's layout that would have gone unnoticed to an untrained observer, but to those who had spent years in the backcountry, these details were impossible to ignore. Rangers accustomed to tracking patterns in nature noticed that the forest around the footbridge felt disjointed. In places, the trees appeared to lean toward each other, curving inward like they were forming an invisible circle. This wasn't typical of the Alder Creek region, where trees grew straight and tall, reaching toward the sky. Yet here, the trunks of the trees seemed to arch slightly, bending inward as though the forest itself was aware of something watching. As the team moved deeper into the area, the air felt unnaturally still. The usual chorus of birdsong was absent, and even the wind, which had been steady on the other side of the creek, seemed to dissipate as they crossed the water. It was as if the forest had swallowed every sound, leaving only the distant rush of the creek behind them. Yet when the rangers stopped and stood still, they began to notice something even stranger. In certain spots, the temperature shifted. Pockets of warm air seemed to hover at the tree line, a sharp contrast to the chill of the surrounding forest. They could not explain it. There was no wind, no immediate change in sunlight, but the heat lingered in isolated spots, moving in subtle waves across the ground. These shifts didn't follow any natural pattern. In some cases, the warm pockets would last for minutes before fading. Other times, they would reappear in different parts of the forest, as though the land itself were adjusting its temperature on its own accord. Rangers found it unsettling, as if the forest was reacting to their presence. The warmth was localized and short-lived, but the sensation of something shifting in the air, as if the environment itself were aware of their movements, unsettled everyone in the search party. Even the soundscape around the footbridge behaved differently than expected. When they called out, their voices came back with a noticeable delay, a second or two longer than normal, as though the sound had to travel farther than it should. The delay was not consistent, however. Sometimes it was brief, a barely perceptible echo, and at other times it lingered, stretching out into an unnatural rhythm. The rangers paused, exchanging glances, unsure of how to explain the distortion. Some joked nervously that it was nothing more than forest acoustics at work, but none of them felt entirely comfortable. The echoes didn't behave like natural reverberation. It felt off, like something was pulling the sound into places it shouldn't go. What truly unsettled the search teams, however, was the strange occurrence of moving trees. As they examined the area more closely, several of the rangers noted that a few trees appeared to shift position as they moved deeper into the woods. At first, they assumed it was a trick of the light, or the way the branches swayed in the wind. But the more they observed, the more they realized that the trees were not behaving normally. Some of the trees' positions seemed slightly altered, as if they had been pushed or moved overnight. They were not entirely uprooted, but their positions were unnervingly off-kilter, like a set of objects being slightly shifted in a game of optical illusion.
One of the rangers, an older man with decades of experience, remarked that he had never seen anything like it before. He ran his hand across the bark of a nearby oak, feeling the deep grooves in the rough texture. He frowned, staring at the base of the trunk, where he noticed fresh scratches in the soil, a shallow indentation, as though something had recently brushed against it. Yet the tree itself showed no sign of any significant damage. It was simply off balance. These observations piled on top of the already unusual feeling that the forest around the footbridge had its own agenda. The trees appeared to be leaning inwards, as if forming an invisible perimeter, encircling the searchers without actively closing in. The odd shifting air pockets became more pronounced as they moved closer to the bridge itself. These sensations were subtle but cumulative, each small clue stacking on top of the last, contributing to a growing sense of unease among the team. They were no longer sure they were dealing with just a physical landscape. At the footbridge, the temperature variation was even more pronounced. The wooden planks felt unnaturally warm to the touch, almost as if they had been exposed to sunlight for hours. Yet the sky remained overcast, with no rays breaking through the canopy above. The warmth was not consistent across the bridge either. Some spots felt like heated metal beneath the surface, while others were cooler, colder than the surrounding air. A park technician who had joined the team took out his infrared thermometer, and the readings came back with a temperature anomaly that he couldn't explain. He recorded a sharp fluctuation in the bridge's surface temperature, and more disturbingly, the readings didn't correspond to the environment. It wasn't sunlight heating the wood, nor was it something else in the vicinity creating the warmth. The heat appeared to be radiating from beneath the surface of the bridge itself. As the rangers continued to inspect the area, another strange observation became apparent. When they examined the soil near the footbridge, they found a subtle indentation, a faint trail that led directly toward the bridge but abruptly ended at its edge. It didn't look like a typical animal path, nor did it appear to be the result of a person walking through the area. It was a shallow, circular depression, almost as though something had been standing there for some time, watching. The sensation grew stronger as they approached the bridge itself. They had come to look for clues about Ethan's disappearance,
But now they were left with an eerie sense of being watched by something they couldn't see or understand. The temperature variations, the strange tree positioning, the echoes that didn't make sense, it all pointed to something more than just a forgotten trail and an abandoned bridge. When the team set up a motion sensor camera by the footbridge and returned hours later to review the footage, they found something that wasn't supposed to be there. A fleeting shadow moving beneath the bridge, too tall and too straight to be human, its edges distorted as if bending the very air around it. Ethan Hale was an experienced backpacker, well-versed in the tools that guided him through both familiar and unfamiliar terrain. His GPS watch, a cutting-edge model that tracked his route in real time, had never failed him in all the years of backcountry hiking. Yet when search teams examined the device's final recorded data, it was clear something had gone horribly wrong. The final movement recorded by his watch was unlike anything an experienced hiker would do. It showed a perfect circle, repeated twice, right in the middle of the forest, before halting abruptly. And then, nothing. The GPS data was precise. Every movement Ethan had made up until that point had been documented in minute detail, from his first step out of camp to his gradual approach to the abandoned footbridge. It showed how he had moved along the familiar Alder Creek Trail, made slight adjustments to his path to avoid fallen logs, and slowed his pace near the old footbridge. But then, just as he reached the clearing near the creek, the watch recorded a peculiar event, a full circle, a loop so perfectly symmetrical it defied explanation. The data showed him walking in a tight 10-foot radius, stepping back over the same ground he had just covered. This wasn't a moment of indecision or a hesitation caused by confusion or exhaustion. Ethan was deliberately walking in a circle. The GPS readings captured every second, showing the loop repeated twice before the device froze. No further movement was recorded, as if time itself had stopped. There was no indication that Ethan fell, stumbled, or became incapacitated. He had simply walked in a precise, deliberate pattern, and then the data stopped. Investigators were baffled. The terrain around the footbridge was straightforward, with no obstacles that would have caused Ethan to lose his way. There was no reason for him to circle back in this manner, especially not when the footbridge and its strange surroundings were right in front of him. He had walked this trail before and knew the landmarks well. There was nothing physically challenging about this area. But the data showed no explanation, only the strange, unexplainable loop that seemed to go nowhere. As the search teams pored over the final GPS coordinates, they discovered another anomaly, the elevation data. When Ethan made the loop, the watch recorded a brief spike in altitude, barely noticeable to the naked eye, but significant enough for the team to flag it. The reading was entirely out of place. There was no hill or rise in the terrain where the elevation could have increased. The area around the footbridge was relatively flat, yet for a brief moment Ethan's watch indicated a vertical shift. It was as though his body had moved upward, but with no logical explanation. The spike lasted only a few seconds before the watch reset, returning to its normal, steady readings. And then, as if the loop had been a glitch in the system, the GPS stopped tracking altogether. No final step, no abrupt halt, just an eerie silence that followed the last known location. Some of the rangers speculated that the GPS malfunctioned due to environmental factors, such as the dense canopy above or the proximity of the creek. But this explanation didn't hold up. The GPS watch was designed to work under heavy cover, and no part of the terrain suggested a GPS blackout. The loop, the sudden altitude spike, and the abrupt halt in data all pointed to something far stranger than a technical failure. The data wasn't the only thing that seemed off. Ethan's physical tracks, which were carefully documented by the search team, showed no signs of the looping behavior the GPS recorded. His footprints appeared in a linear progression, as expected, following the trail toward the footbridge, but there was no evidence of him retracing his steps. The ground was soft enough to preserve any irregularities in his stride,
Yet there were no indications of him walking in circles. Rangers examined the area in more detail, looking for signs of a struggle or an accident, but the forest was strangely calm, with no signs of disturbance or erratic movement. The soil was undisturbed and the vegetation was intact. There was no sign of Ethan stumbling, tripping, or losing his balance. The land seemed to have absorbed him into its folds, as if he had simply vanished. But the GPS data suggested otherwise. His device had recorded him standing still, pacing, circling, but it didn't explain why.
The more investigators delved into the data, the more they realized that something beyond natural physical forces was at play. The GPS readings were not random glitches. They felt deliberate, as if something, maybe even the landscape itself, had guided Ethan into that strange loop. The idea that Ethan's watch had malfunctioned due to a technical issue seemed increasingly unlikely. It was as if he had been led into a pattern by an invisible force, one that caused him to walk in a loop before disappearing entirely. The team decided to retrace Ethan's steps using the GPS route. They carefully followed his exact path, hoping to find some clue, some indication of why he had made the circle. As they walked, they felt the unsettling sensation that the landscape was shifting around them. It wasn't obvious at first, but as they moved deeper into the forest, they began to notice subtle changes in the way the trees grew, the way the light filtered through the canopy, and the way the ground seemed to slightly tilt beneath their feet. It was as if the very forest was playing tricks on their senses, rearranging itself just beyond their awareness. The sense of unease grew as they approached the footbridge again, the place where Ethan had made his final loop. The temperature dropped by a few degrees as they neared the water, and the air felt heavier, as if pressing them downward. A low hum began to emanate from the creek, barely audible but consistent, filling the silence with an almost tangible presence. They had walked this path many times, but now it felt different, as though they were not meant to be here. When the rangers reached the spot where Ethan's GPS had frozen, they found something unexpected, a faint circular depression in the soil, as though something large and heavy had stood there for just a moment. The depression was too symmetrical to be natural, too deliberate in its shape, and in the center, a small rock was displaced, wedged at an angle as if something had carefully set it there. The discovery of Ethan Hale's GoPro camera should have been a pivotal breakthrough in the search for answers. Found about 50 yards from the abandoned footbridge, it was nearly submerged in a small pool of water, its lens slightly cracked but otherwise intact. The device had been in his possession during his hikes, and the fact that it had continued recording for hours after his disappearance offered the team a chance to peer into the mystery of what had happened to him. What they would find, however, would complicate everything they thought they knew about the case. At first glance, the footage appeared to be nothing more than a collection of mundane trail shots, rippling water, the sway of branches in the wind, and the occasional glimpse of his boots crunching through underbrush. There was nothing alarming, nothing that immediately suggested that the camera's last moments would be anything but ordinary. But as the investigators went through the recordings frame by frame, they noticed something peculiar in the later footage that had been recorded after Ethan had last been seen. The timestamp on the footage showed that the camera was still running several hours after Ethan's last recorded GPS location. The first few hours were relatively unremarkable. The camera recorded the peaceful surroundings of Alder Creek Trail, birds flitting overhead, and Ethan walking in his usual methodical, steady pace. But the further into the footage they ventured, the more unsettling the images became. The footage took on a strange, warped quality, as though the very environment Ethan had been documenting was shifting just out of sync with reality. In one frame, Ethan is seen walking along the trail toward the footbridge, a moment captured before he vanished from the GPS trail. His footsteps are steady, his movement deliberate, but there's something about the way the shadows stretch across the ground, too long, too exaggerated, that doesn't quite sit right, as if the light itself was bending around him, as though the forest had begun to react to his presence. It was subtle, but it was there. The next section of footage, recorded much later, would prove to be the most disturbing. As Ethan neared the footbridge, the camera's focus wavered. The lens shook slightly, as though something had jarred the device. Then, just as the camera captured the base of the footbridge, the image flickered almost imperceptibly, and in the flicker, something strange appeared. A shadow. At first, the team dismissed it. Shadows were common on trail cams, caused by clouds passing overhead or the natural sway of trees. But this shadow was different. It didn't match any of the objects in the frame. There was no reason for such a long, unnaturally tall figure to appear just before the flicker. The shadow was too smooth, too elongated, as if it were an outline of something that wasn't fully visible in the real world. It was not the reflection of Ethan's body. In fact, it didn't seem to belong to anyone at all. Then came the sound. The microphone on the GoPro had recorded a faint, low hum, a noise that couldn't be placed. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the sound of water running. It was a sound that seemed to come from the trees themselves, low and constant, vibrating with a subtle, almost imperceptible frequency. The hum persisted through the video, growing louder and more pronounced, as if the very air around Ethan was reacting to something unseen. As the footage progressed, the figure in the shadow grew clearer. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was impossible to define. There were no distinct features, no arms, no legs, just a form, a silhouette, standing eerily still on the edge of the footbridge. And then, as the camera blinked again, the figure seemed to shift slightly, bending, as though it were moving toward Ethan. The lens, which had been steadily focused on the bridge, jerked away suddenly, as if the camera had been caught off guard by an unseen force. Ethan's breathing, audible through the microphone, grew heavier, sharper, as if he had sensed the presence behind him. Yet there was no visual evidence that he had turned around or looked back. When investigators reviewed the footage again, they noticed another detail that had gone unnoticed in their first pass. The timestamp was slowly speeding up. The seconds between each frame were shortening, distorting the perception of time. It was as if the camera was recording more quickly than it should have been, as if the events happening in the video weren't unfolding in real time, but rather in some altered, accelerated timeline. Then, the camera abruptly cut to black. No warning, no jarring transition, just a black screen where the footage should have continued. The last sound recorded was Ethan's rapid, shallow breathing and the faint hum that had been growing in intensity right before the screen went dark. The device had recorded nothing after that, nothing but silence. The eerie part of this discovery was that the camera had not been turned off manually. Ethan's gear was meticulously organized, but there was no sign that he had intentionally stopped the recording. The GoPro had simply ceased working, as if something had forced it to stop. Something invisible, yet profoundly powerful. This left the investigators with more questions than answers. Had Ethan been aware of the presence he seemed to have captured on the camera? If so, why didn't he mention it in any of the notes he had written or recorded? Had the camera caught a glimpse of something that wasn't physically present, something that only revealed itself when the right conditions were met? And most importantly, why had the footage stopped when it did? They weren't just looking for answers about Ethan's disappearance anymore. They were looking at something much larger, something that defied natural laws, a presence, a force, or perhaps something else entirely that could manipulate time, space, and perception. As investigators prepared to leave the command center for the night, one technician made a final check of the GoPro's file system. He paused when he noticed something chilling. There was one last file, hidden deep within the camera's folder. A single frame from a recording that had never been viewed. Ethan's face, eyes wide in terror, just inches from the lens. And behind him, a dark figure, standing taller than any man could. The figure's face was smooth. No eyes, no mouth, just an absence where a face should have been. When the Rangers finally turned back from the footbridge, the air around them felt different, heavier, as though the forest was holding its breath. Ethan Hale's disappearance had long since entered the realm of the unexplainable, but now it felt as if they weren't just looking for a missing person. They were searching for something that had already been erased. The search had moved beyond missing boots, backpacks, and gear. The forest wasn't just holding on to its secrets, it was becoming a part of the mystery itself, as if it were actively obscuring the truth. Ethan's final movements, captured by his GPS, had shown that he took a precise and deliberate path toward the footbridge, but after that, his trail simply vanished. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbances in the undergrowth. The soil remained untouched even after hours of searchers combing the area. It was as though the ground had absorbed Ethan's presence, swallowing him whole, leaving no trace behind. But even stranger, the path that Ethan was meant to take, his planned route according to the map and his itinerary, suddenly didn't align with anything they could find on the ground. Rangers and investigators had followed the trail that should have led Ethan back to camp, but with each step, they grew more uncertain. There was no path that seemed to pick up where he had last been. The map folded so carefully to the hidden trail, and the GPS anomaly, the loop, and the fading data, it all pointed to a place that couldn't be seen. The physical trail didn't just disappear, it felt as though it had never existed. As they ventured deeper into the woods, something else began to feel off, an uncanny sensation of being watched. This wasn't a feeling brought on by fear. It was a creeping, unshakable certainty that the forest was more aware than they were. The trees seemed to grow closer, their trunks more densely packed. Every step felt like they were crossing into a space that was not meant for them. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the only sound was the soft crunch of leaves beneath their boots. But it wasn't the silence that unsettled them. It was the way the silence stretched, elongated, as if it were responding to their every move. A park ranger, walking slightly ahead of the group, noticed something strange. He paused, his foot hovering above the ground. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a slight shift in the landscape. But then, as he stepped forward, he realized that the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as it should have been. The earth seemed to ripple just for a split second, as if it were folding inward, closing in around them. He stopped, confused, and took another cautious step. The sensation returned. He quickly turned to the others, signaling them to stop. "We need to be careful here," he murmured, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something's wrong. The rest of the group gathered around him, eyes scanning the forest, looking for any indication of what he had felt. But there was nothing. No fallen branches, no collapsed ground, no sign of movement. Yet something intangible hovered in the air, pushing against them, pressing inward from all sides. The sensation of displacement was subtle but unmistakable.
As they continued forward, the silence deepened and the forest seemed to close in tighter around them. The path that Ethan had meant to take, based on his itinerary, was nowhere to be found. There was no trace of his steps, no visible signs of where he had gone. The land felt like it had been rewritten, as though someone or something had erased the route Ethan had planned and replaced it with something else, something that led nowhere. At one point, they stumbled upon an old stone marker, half buried in the undergrowth. It was worn and weathered, but the symbol carved into its surface was still visible. It looked like a faded version of a map marker, something that could have been used to delineate a trail long ago, but it didn't match any modern trails in the park. The shape, though indistinct, resembled the layout of the region near the footbridge. It wasn't a coincidence.
Whatever this marker represented, it seemed to be pointing them back toward the same area, the footbridge, the place they had just left. But how could this be? They were miles away from the bridge now, and the marker had clearly been here for decades. The implications were chilling. The search team had thought they were progressing, moving away from the footbridge, yet now it seemed as though the land itself was pulling them back. They were caught in a cycle, a loop, like the one Ethan had experienced with his GPS. They weren't moving forward, they were moving in a direction that had already been written for them, one that led them back to the very place where they started. Ethan had experienced this same sensation before, caught in a loop of shifting terrain, unable to move beyond a certain point. His last GPS reading showed him walking in a perfect circle, his watch documenting every step, recording his every movement as if he were stuck in some invisible net. He hadn't gone anywhere. He had just walked, over and over again, retracing the same ground. Now the search team was feeling it too. It wasn't just the earth that was shifting, it was the path itself. They had been walking for hours trying to find a way out of the loop, but the more they pushed forward, the more the land seemed to fold inward, pulling them back into the same spot. The trees leaned closer, the shadows deepened, and the path ahead became less distinct. They weren't just looking for Ethan anymore, they were looking for a way out. As the team regrouped, preparing to adjust their course once again, one ranger looked down and noticed something strange. A fresh set of footprints in the dirt, following the same path they had just walked. The tracks were clear, too new to have been left by anyone else. But the strange thing was, they weren't leading away from the footbridge. They were leading right back to it.
Ethan Hale's disappearance was never about getting lost. It was about stepping into something the forest had hidden for years. The footbridge, the strange anomalies, and the eerie loops in his GPS data pointed to a presence beyond nature's control, something that moved the land itself. In the end, the forest didn't just take Ethan, it rewrote the path he thought he knew, bending time and space in ways no one could explain. The unanswered questions remain, waiting for someone else brave enough to follow the same route. Some mysteries, it seems, are meant to stay hidden, while others are drawn to the edge of reality itself. If this story left you questioning what's lurking just beyond the map, you're not alone. There are more forgotten trails, hidden forces, and mysteries that blur the line between reality and something darker. Curiosity doesn't just lead you down paths, it leads you into places that want to be discovered. Stay tuned, because the next story might just be waiting for you to take the first step.